Namaste. My name is Neelima. Welcome to Reflections Along the Way podcast, where you will be listening to reflections from learnings and experiences along my life's journey. When we first start our spiritual life, we wonder, where has this world come from? Where will it go? And all those sort of questions. And after we start understanding about the outer world, then we start reflecting on what is this body? How do these sense organs function and all that, right? For example, for a person who is blind, they cannot see any form. Similarly, for a person who is deaf, they can see forms moving, but they can't hear anything. And for us to enjoy any taste or smell, we need a nose and a tongue. If none of these sense organs are present, then we can't experience the world, right? We cannot taste, we cannot smell, we cannot see, and so on. So basically, if we take out these sense organs, then there's no world for us. It's as though that there is nothing, right? Then we have to come to a conclusion that our concept of this world is only gained through our sense organs. Now, the sense organs by themselves, they cannot function without a mind. Because like when we are sleeping and all, there is no mind, right? Mind does not function. And since the mind is not functioning, the sense organs are also not functioning at that point. So then we start further inquiry as to, okay, how is this mind working then? And where are we getting this joy and sorrow from? So on and on, we continue our probing into the inner realms, the subtler realms of the mind. And as we move more and more within, we move in our contemplative search toward the center, which is the self. In Vedanta, each of these external covers of the self, external coatings of the self, is termed as a sheath, kosha in Sanskrit. Just as like a sheath kind of covers the blade of the sword, similarly, all these sheaths, all these koshas appear to cover the self, which actually is not touched by these coverings. Now, our body forms like the grossest covering, and that's called the physical sheath. A little bit subtler than the body is the vital air sheath. And more subtler is the mental sheath, which is the mind. More subtler than the mind is the intellectual sheath. And subtler than that is the bliss sheath, which is the seat of joy. So these 5 distinct sheaths are called panchakoshas in Sanskrit. Panchakoshas means 5 sheaths. So just to go over them again, they are the food sheath, which is called annamaya kosha in Sanskrit. The second one is the vital air sheath, pranamaya kosha. Third is the mental sheath, manomaya kosha. Fourth is the intellectual sheath, Vijnanamaya kosha, and fifth is the bliss sheath, which is Anandamaya kosha. Now the food sheath is the physical body. That's the outermost covering of the self. And beyond this, we do not physically exist. Now why is it called food sheath? Because this body is emerged from the essence of the food assimilated by the father, and then this body is nourished in the womb by the food eaten by the mother, and this body continues to exist because of the food eaten by us as an individual. And after that, ultimately, after death, it goes back to fertilize the earth and it becomes food for plants and worms. So this physical body, it arises out of food, it exists in food, and it goes back to becoming food. And that is why it is called the food sheath. Now this food sheath has 5 organs of perception, which are called Gnana Indriyas, and 5 organs of action called the karma indriyas. The 5 organs of perception through which we perceive and get knowledge are eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and skin. And the 5 organs of action, which are karma indriyas, are hands, legs, organs of speech, genital organs, and organs of evacuation. Now, through these 5 organs of perception, we get stimuli from the external world in the form of color, form, smell, taste, sounds, touch, etc. Right? Through these only we perceive things. So, through these 5 organs of perception, we receive stimuli from the external world. And the mind and intellect react based on those stimuli, and the mind intellect equipment issues responses, and these responses are expressed by the organs of action. The 5 faculties, which are called panchapranas, they correspond to 5 physiological systems that are detailed by physiologists, and they represent the vital air sheath or pranamaya kosha. And the 5 faculties that comprise the sheath are the faculty of perception or prana. So this controls the perceptions of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching. The second one is the faculty of excretion, which is apana. This controls throwing out by the body, such as sperm, feces, sweat, etc. And this faculty of digestion, samana, digests the food that the stomach intakes. The fourth one is vyana, that's a faculty of circulation that distributes the food that is digested to various parts of the body through the bloodstream. And the fifth one is the faculty of thinking, which is udana. That has the capacity to entertain, understand, absorb, assimilate new thoughts, and this capacity is what helps us to get new knowledge, learn, to educate ourselves, etc. The faculty of thinking or udana is different from intellect, which is called buddhi. Intellect is the faculty of discrimination. Udana just has the capacity of acquiring new knowledge. But intellect, buddhi, is what allows us to discriminate based on the knowledge that we already possess. Because of the background knowledge, we can judge between whether something is good or bad, whether something is right or wrong, etc. As we grow, gradually the person loses one's faculty of thinking. But very likely he or she attains a sharper intellect, because as a person grows, there's a bunch of knowledge that has already been accumulated. So the individual can make decisions based on this reservoir of knowledge that's already present. And these functions, the vital air functions, are manifested as long as the person is breathing air. And that is why they're together called the vital air sheath. Now, this vital air sheath is what controls and regulates the food sheath. When the pranas are not functioning properly according to their particular function, then the physical body is affected by it. And as a person advances in age, the 5 faculties gradually become weaker and weaker. Next 2 sheaths are the mental and intellectual sheaths. Now, the mental sheath is what regulates the vital air sheath. For example, if your mind is upset, then the function of the pranas is also affected, and eventually the physical body is also affected. When the mind is very joyful, then the vital air sheath works very efficiently, and so does the food sheath. Now, the intellectual sheath is more subtler than the mental sheath. And to understand this better, then we need to kind of distinguish and differentiate between mind and intellect. So the mind receives these stimuli from the external world, right? And that is through the sense organs. Whenever these sense organs perceive the world, they send stimuli to the mind. and the mind receives those stimuli. Now, the intellect is the faculty which discriminates. It examines and judges the stimuli based on whatever knowledge that's already there and receives this information from the mind, and it kind of examines it, and it has this capacity to discriminate. After it kind of judges and examines it, it communicates its decision back to the mind, and the mind sends directive to the organs of action to respond to the world. Now, for example, if we touch a really hot plate, as soon as we touch it, we quickly remove the hand, right? But just in that small action, there are a series of things that happen. So as soon as our finger touches that plate, that hot plate, then the skin, it carries that stimulus of heat to the mind. And the mind sends that information to the intellect. Now the intellect has a memory from past experiences which says that, hey, that's dangerous, that's going to burn our skin. The intellect sends this decision to the mind that the hand has to be removed. And the mind communicates that to those respective muscles in the body. And that's what actually makes us physically remove that finger from the hot plate. Now, the second distinction is the mind is a continuous flow of thoughts. If each thought is compared to like a bucket of water, then the mind can be compared to a river, which is nothing but a flow of water. Now, the bucket of water has no power on its own, right? But when lots and lots of buckets of water come together in continuous motion, you continuously start pouring water one bucket after another, then there's strength to it, right? Similarly, when thoughts are flowing continuously, then there is this apparent power and strength. That's called the mind. Now, the direction of the flow of water or river is determined by its banks. If the banks are turning to the left, the water in the river turns to the left, right? In the same way, the human intellect can set the direction of the thought flow. If a person is very noble, then the thoughts flowing in the mind will be noble also. If, however, the intellect is vulgar, then the mind also follows that same suit. And the actions that follow are also not so noble. Now, the mind is also a seat of emotions. It could be greed, love, hatred, jealousy, empathy, and so on. Whereas the intellect, it's like a springboard of ideas such as liberty, mathematical formulas, freedom, etc. Now, the mind can only function in known realms, whereas the intellect can reach into realms of thought that hasn't been explored yet. The mind is always changing. It always is oscillating back and forth. When these thoughts stabilize and they form this judgment, a willful judgment, then that function is called intellect. So when there is doubt and indecisiveness, then that's the function of the mind. But when one makes a firm decision, those thoughts reflect the status of the intellect. So basically, what is the mind at one moment, it becomes the intellect at another moment. And vice versa. The intellect can be reduced to the status of the mind when the decisions are broken by another powerful idea or powerful intellect, right? This kind of changing between mind and intellect, it's possible because these are purely functional. It's not like that two different organs called the mind and the intellect. These are only functions. There's no structure to it. So both of them are basically thoughts. Now, the bliss sheath is the innermost of all the 5 sheaths, and it's the most subtle. This sheath consists vasanas. Vasanas, as we've studied before, are those inherent tendencies that each of us have before they become grosser into thoughts and actions. And this sheath is experienced in the state of deep sleep. In that state, there's no manifestation of any thoughts or actions. It's basically complete ignorance, like I know nothing. I don't know anything in that state. This is called bliss sheath because whenever we are in deep sleep, we experience a relative bliss, right? In the waking and dream state, there are agitations. But once we sleep, this undisturbed peace, right? I mean, whether we are rich or poor or healthy, unhealthy, whatever. And it's basically peaceful because we don't have all the agitations that we experience in the waking or dream states, right? They've totally stopped. But this state, this bliss is not the same as the infinite bliss that one experiences in the state of God realization. In Vedanta, a lot of terms are used to describe that realm, such as bliss sheath, vasanas, ignorance, state of deep sleep, causal body, non-apprehension, etc. They're very prevalent when we are studying Vedanta. So the knowledge of these is essential to understand better. In essence, all these are the same, but they're each used to indicate a certain aspect of the same thing. Now, beyond these 5 sheaths is Om, the self, Atman, which is the core, right? These 5 sheaths are like layers of dress which are worn by the self. Each of these sheaths is different from the wearer or the Atman. When we are describing these sheaths, we say that like vital air sheath is within the food sheath, the mental sheath is within vital air sheath, the intellectual sheath is within mental sheath, and the bliss sheath is the innermost within the intellectual sheath, and the self is the core, the innermost. And when we are describing, sometimes we feel that, oh, self is very minute and it's very small, which is like inside all these layers and layers of matter. But in the Upanishads, this self is described as all-pervading. So this term is to be understood in philosophical way, not like in a physical way, and we think of this self as something very small or something like that. So basically, when they say something is within something, it just means that it is more subtler than the outer one. And the subtler one is what controls and feeds the outer sheath. So what that indicates is the self is the subtlest of all. It is the one which controls and nourishes all the other 5 layers of sheaths. Now again, what does subtlety mean? Subtlety means that it's measured by its pervasiveness. For example, when a piece of ice melts, the water that forms out of it occupies more area, right? In philosophy, we would say that water is subtler than ice. Similarly, when the water is boiled, then the steam that's generated, it spreads through the entire atmosphere. So the steam is subtler than the water. Similarly, the food sheath is considered as the grossest of all the layers, as it's the least pervasive, right? Because the dimensions of the body, the physical body, it's almost the same at all times. It may expand a few inches here and there based on how heavy the meal is and so on. But the perceptions of the vital air sheath, they go beyond the boundaries of the physical body, right? Because the sense organs perceive forms, sounds, smells, etc. that lie beyond the physical body, physical structure, correct? So the vital air sheath is more pervasive than the food sheath and hence is subtler than the food sheath. Now the mental sheath is even more pervasive, and it's more pervasive than the vital air sheath because the mind can comprehend, or it can go into areas beyond the scope of the physical perception. So basically, if we had visited some place for vacation or something, even though we are not in this place now, the mind can perceive that place. It can travel to areas beyond the scope of the physical perception, right? So that's why the mental sheath is more pervasive and hence more subtler than the vital air sheath. Now, the intellectual sheath, it extends farther than the mental sheath, because mental sheath or the mind can only travel to the realms of what is already known. But intellectual sheath can comprehend into the realms which are unknown, the new areas of thought. And that's why it is subtler than the mental sheath. The bliss sheath is the most pervasive of all these 5, because it consists of vasanas, and it is the one which controls the behavior of all the other 4 layers, other 4 sheaths. Because vasanas are the cause of the other sheaths. And because it's the cause, it's inherently there in the other 4 sheaths, which are the effect of this sheath. And none of the other 4 areas have access to this bliss sheath. The self pervades all these 5 sheaths. It's all pervading. It's infinite. And the subtlety of this self is beyond the human comprehension. It's beyond the mind, beyond the intellect. And hence the goal of life is to transcend all these 5 sheaths and learn to identify with this pure self, which is infinite, which is limitless, and which is all pervading. That core of joy and peace, which is veiled by all these other sheaths temporarily. Thank you for listening to today's reflections. If you'd like to connect with me, please visit bluishmuse.com. Until next time, namaste.